Thank you so much. So yes, I'm Jack Wilkinson from the University of Manchester. Thanks so much for having me to discuss this work where we look to answer this question: can editors estimate the citation potential of manuscripts? A quick disclaimer before we continue. My co-authors are all affiliated with the BMJ. I am not affiliated with the BMJ. So if I say anything silly, that's entirely my fault, not the BMJ. So all of the work that we're discussing here took place at the BMJ, and we all know the BMJ. It's the fourth ranked general medical journal. And the studies we looked at in this research were all submitted in 2015 to 2016. And during that time, the BMJ received around 3,500 submissions per year. 80% of those were rejected without being sent for peer review. A further 10% were rejected after being peer reviewed by both academic and patient reviewers. The ones that survived peer review, 10%, they then went to a manuscript meeting where an editorial committee discussed the paper and determined the fate of each one, basically. And then at the end of all that, around 5% would be accepted for publication. So what we did is, ahead of that manuscript meeting, we asked the editors to estimate the citation potential of those manuscripts. And we asked them to estimate how many citations each manuscript would receive in the year that it was published and in the year following. And we asked the editors to put them into one of these four categories. So would the manuscript receive more than the BMJ average number of citations, more than 17? Would it receive around the BMJ average, 10 to 17, or indeed below the BMJ average? Or would it receive no citations at all? And actually that no citations category was barely used. And in what follows, I've combined the low and no citations categories. We then had a look to see, where the papers published. For the ones that were rejected from the BMJ, were they published somewhere else? And then we had a look on Web of Science to see how many citations these all received. So what did we find? So we had 508 studies that were published in full and indexed in Web of Science. Just 22 remained unpublished by 2022. We looked at 507 manuscripts that were published by the end of 2019, because for these ones, we had the full citation data for the follow-up period. The average number of citations was 8, but there was a lot of variation, so a range of 0 to 150. Most of the papers generated below the BMJ average number of citations. A fifth generated around the BMJ average. Just under a quarter generated above the BMJ average. And citations were higher for papers that were accepted by the BMJ compared to those that were rejected. So we had 10 editors in this study. They're all given a letter here. And all of the editors rated different numbers of manuscripts, as shown in this bar chart here. So we had 6 editors rating sort of more than 200 manuscripts, and 4 rating fewer than 100. And how well did they do? That's the big question. Okay, so how accurate were these ratings? So let's start by looking at the predicted citation categories against the actual number of citations. So here I've pooled all of the ratings from all of the editors for all of the manuscripts, and we have one box here for each predicted citation category, okay? And I think you can see quite clearly that as we move along the categories from low to high, the average number of citations did indeed get slightly higher. And you can see a sort of more marked increase at the upper end of the distribution. So the upper quartile increases more starkly across the categories. But I think you can clearly see that there's a lot of variation in the number of citations within each one of these categories. So if you look at the high box, for example, studies that were predicted to have more than 17 citations, a large number of those articles actually have much lower numbers of citations, so 10 or less, for example. So straight away, that perhaps suggests accuracy was not incredible. We can look at the accuracy of each individual editor, okay? So each editor has a bar. The proportion in red shows how often they got the incorrect rating, if you like. And you can see that editors got it wrong most of the time. So 9 out of 10 editors were unable to identify the correct citation category for as many as half of the manuscripts they assessed. We can also quantify the agreements by calculating the kappa statistic, and that again suggested poor accuracy for all of the editors. We might be interested in looking at how often the editors got it very wrong, okay? So how often did they put the low cited papers in the high category and vice versa? So here I'm showing you the first of those. These are the low. How often did the editors predict that they would be highly cited? And actually that doesn't happen too often, okay? So the proportion in red in each bar is quite low. So that's not a big concern. But if we flip things around the other way and ask how often the highly cited papers were predicted to fall in that low category, well, that happens much more frequently. Okay, so for some editors, most of the time, they thought that would be the case. So all of this combines to suggest that actually, perhaps the editors cannot estimate the citation potential of manuscripts with accuracy. At the suggestion of a peer reviewer to our abstract for this conference, we conducted a few secondary analyses. So first of all, we considered using the total number of citations 2 years following publication instead of 1. That's closer to how the impact factor is calculated, but it's important to note that that isn't what the editors were asked to predict. But we had a look. Prediction still works out as very poor if we do that. All editors got less than half correct. We also had a look at what happens if we separate out the papers that were accepted for publication in BMJ versus those that were published elsewhere. This results in small numbers for some editors, but for the articles published in the BMJ, all editors got sort of fewer than 50% correct. For non-BMJ articles, a couple of editors did manage to get most of them correct. That was driven by lots of correct low classifications. And we also looked at what happens if we used more than 30 citations as the high category, although again, important to note that that isn't what the editors were actually asked to do. Or bar one editor predicted that most of those papers receiving more than 30 citations would receive fewer than 18 citations, okay? So that they would fall in the low or medium categories. So again, this is all supportive of the main finding of generally poor predictive ability. Just to finish them, what can we take away? So we think that we know that many editors are motivated to publish highly citable papers because that determines the journal impact factor. Perhaps that introduces some sort of biases around which articles get published and where. But what we found in this study is, as a matter of fact, the BMJ editors were perhaps not very good at doing that. They weren't very good at estimating the citation potential of the manuscripts. We'll conduct some further analyses. So does this vary by specialty? Does it vary by study design? Perhaps editors are better at estimating the citation potential of RCTs compared to non-randomized studies of interventions, for example. Perhaps they're better at predicting the citation potential of methodological papers or reporting guidelines. We'll try to take a look at this. And we're also interested in looking at, in some way, the collective assessment of the editors rather than looking at each editor individually, because obviously that's how decisions to accept or reject are made collectively. So I'll finish there. Thank you very much for listening, and I'll try to answer your questions to the best of my ability. Thank you.
Thank you. That was fascinating. I've proved it myself. I'm not very good at it. So I think we can start. Let's start 1, 2, 3. We'll just go clockwise. Ivan?
Ivan Ransky, I'm from Retraction Watch. Really interesting. And I don't think Brian is still here, at least I haven't seen him. But have you looked at sort of how these data compare to what Brian Nosek and his team are doing in terms of predictions of replication, reproducibility? Because it's, you know, citation is certainly, it's an important metric to some people, but reproducibility might be a different one.
That's a really interesting suggestion. I've not really thought of that at all, but I guess now that we have that data, we could do it, right? We have that data set there. Yeah, that's a good idea for additional research question. Yeah, thanks.
Okay, Malcolm.
Malcolm MacLeod, University of Edinburgh, conflict of interest. You've rejected many of my papers. And I wonder, because there's a fourth category of paper, which is the ones that you've rejected because they're not of sufficient interest to your readership, which then go on to be published elsewhere. So have you looked at how many citations they accrue? Because the prediction would be you're just as bad at that judgment as you are about the judgments that you've shown here.
I think it's really important to note that I don't work with the BMJ. It's not my fault. I've not rejected any of your papers. I think your papers are fantastic. But no, you make a good point. So any paper that was just rejected at that early stage and not even sent to peer review wouldn't have been included in our study at all, actually. So it was only ones that had made it through peer review and had gone to that manuscript meeting to be discussed by an editorial committee. So actually, we haven't looked at that at all. That's a good point. Yeah.
Okay.
Hi, Steve Goodman, Stanford. Do the editors ever see basic metrics about citation from BMJ? Do they see do you show them the distribution? They have any sense of what the median number is, how it might vary by type? It seems to me if you just showed them those basics, it might be calibrated and they might be much better at this.
That's a good question. I mean, certainly ahead of this survey, the editors all knew that they were putting them in categories that were based on typical numbers of citations for BMJ articles. So that's how the categories in this study were defined, right? Below the typical average number of citations for the BMJ, around the average.
Yeah, but
or above the
averages,
average.
so we know these are highly skewed
Yeah.
distributions.
Yeah.
So you'd want to see
Oh, I see.
the median, you'd want to see the full distribution.
Yeah,
I
good
think.
question. I mean, I know we have some BMJ editors in the room right now who may have more insight into that than I do. And I'd certainly welcome them to speak up.
I can answer.
Yeah, that would be great.
I can answer some of these later.
Okay, fantastic.
In the
Okay.
meantime, let's come here and then we'll go to virtual.
Gunter Eisenbach, JMIR Publications. I presented actually yesterday a somewhat similar paper as a poster, only with the difference that I looked at the reviewer predictions or ratings, because in our review form, we have a similar question about
Mhm.
impact, and I looked at how that correlates with actual citations further down the line. But I also looked at altmetrics, and to my surprise, those impact ratings were better correlated with altmetrics than
Oh.
citations. So could it perhaps be that when editors think about impact, there's more validity, or perhaps altmetrics are the more valid metric to measure impact than citations? Just a provocative question.
Yeah, no, that's an interesting idea, and I don't really have any intuition about that either way. I mean, I wonder with the alt metric, are you picking up engagement with a different audience, perhaps? Maybe that is more relevant, or perhaps it's not more relevant. It's just like you're picking up engagement from a different audience, I guess, on social media compared to researchers who might cite it. But no, that's interesting, and I'm sorry I missed your poster. Actually, I'd really like to hear about that study. Yeah.
Okay, let's go to virtual.
Chris Casey from the CDC asks whether the results were fed back to the editors, their performance and what their thoughts were, and whether they changed in response. And Gerben Turiet of Amsterdam University asks the rationale for doing categories of citations rather than specific 2-year numbers.
Okay. Yes. I mean, I don't actually know if the editors on the BMJ have learned of the results yet. Maybe some of them are hearing them for the first time today. I'm actually not sure of the identity of our editors A, B, C, D, E, F, G. So perhaps, I don't know, maybe some people in this room were represented there. I'm not sure, but I'm sure they will be finding out. Perhaps when they watch this talk, or when we publish the paper, I guess. But that's a good point. And then in terms of why weren't people asked to put a precise number on it? Good question. I think we thought that was just too precise, really. Perhaps it was just too unrealistic to ask people to do that. So we just asked for like a more general categorization, I guess.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Right. Okay, let's go here.
John Ioannidis, Stanford Metrics. Really very interesting data. Given the fact that these distributions are highly skewed, and you have about 90% of the papers being in one group, and you have the superstar 10% papers contributing probably more citations than the other 90%. I would argue that if you want to have any predictive ability, you would focus just on predicting the superstar papers, because the others, 10 citations versus 17 citations, it's like asking too much of anyone to be able to tell. And I think if you had that focus, probably the prediction would be pretty good, not perfect. And I think that it would be different in different journals because they have a different share of superstars. So I think that high impact journals tend to have more superstars by definition, because some papers that are very, very famous and everybody's waiting for them and everybody's going to cite them will go there. Once you go down the impact factor ladder, I think it's completely unpredictable because no superstars will by design go there.
I think you're probably right. So I'm sort of thinking about your suggestion as you're talking there. And I think maybe that's supported by the box plot I showed, maybe. So in the papers that were put into that high category, certainly the papers with the highest number of citations, the really sort of superstar papers, if you like, did all fall in that category. Thinking about it, the upper sort of quartile of the distribution, they did all sort of end up in that high category. So I think you're probably right. Actually, if we did just look at those really highly cited papers, the editors were probably successful in putting those in that high category. I think you're correct. Yeah.
At the back.
Hi, Charlotte Kent, CTC, editor-in-chief of MMWR. I thought on one of your slides, you showed a comparison of citations for things that were published in the BMJ and those that were eventually published elsewhere. Did you? Was that?
Oh,
was
it
that-
did. Yeah.
Yeah, so I think when wasn't the value more than doubled?
Yep.
So that suggests that the editors have some overall sense of what is going to be more highly citable. And I mean, and so I think, you know, it's interesting to me. I think the point that was made by one of our other colleagues here, it's like really, it's kind of having a sense of what are going to be the big high and, you know, the high impact ones that are is most important. Because I felt like you were saying they have no clue, and yet and yet they do have some overall sense of it. You know, it's double the
Yeah.
citations.
Well,
And so
I think it's tricky, right? I find that a bit tricky to interpret for a couple of different reasons. So one possibility is that, you know, being published in the BMJ brings a lot of visibility, high status, high profile, and maybe people cite those papers more partly
Okay,
because
that's
of that,
fair.
right? So there could be a sort of treatment effect, if you like, of being
Uh-huh.
published in the BMJ. That's one possibility. One sort of other sort of complication that I haven't really discussed up to this point is that for the ones that were rejected, there's sort of like this unknowable variability in when that paper is going to be published, and that may have some sort of impact on the number of citations it receives in the year that it's published in the following year. So I'm slightly cautious about how to interpret that statistic that you correctly
Good
pointed
point.
out there was very stark.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, let's come over here.
Do you want me to go at the end?
Yeah.
In case, shall I go at the end?
Okay,
Yeah,
let's go. Let's try and be pretty quick. And we'll just go 1, 2, 3. Yeah.
Michael Mullins, Washington University of St. Louis. I think you got to the right conclusions of we editors are not very good judges of this, and that we tend to make the errors more often on the upside than on the downside. My concern was the question of, you asked the question based upon the parametric statistic of asking of above average or not, when you knew the distribution is clearly skewed. I think it would have been more useful if you had asked the question of which quartile will this be in, because you know, the 17 was not even within the 75th percentile of any of the other 3 box plots. So 17 was like way outside the center of mass.
Yeah, you could be right. Yeah, potentially. So that's the categories they came up with respectively. You're right. Maybe we could have come up with a different categorization scheme. Yeah,
Thank you.
You're right.
Hi, I'm Manolis Antonioganakis, American Physical Society. I have 2 quick points to make. The first is, since BMJ is a very selective journal, I believe that there is literature that shows that in very selective journals, and very novel, truly novel papers that get published there sometimes take a bit longer to garner many citations than just 0 or 1 years. So that could explain part of it. And the other point I wanted to make, perhaps more fundamentally, is that because it has such a high rejection rate and a very high impact factor, I don't know how conscious or subconscious the editors are about retaining those standards. But it is also, I think, the case that high impact factor and highly selective journals, their editors tend to be more conservative and more cautious about letting a poor paper through. And that might explain the discrepancy in the 2 plots that you showed, that they were more likely to be conservative and to categorize a paper as likely to be low-cited, even though it did well later. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah, so in terms of the first one, perhaps if we'd define the outcome slightly differently over a longer period of time, and particularly ask the editors to make predictions on that basis, maybe we'd see a different picture, quite possibly. In terms of the second one, I can't really provide much insight on that, but that would be an explanation, right, for the data that we saw. Thank you.
Okay, so Cameron Abbasi, editor-in-chief of the BMJ. That was an amazing study you presented, the best I've seen in the last 2 days. Congratulations for that tremendous work you've done. Just to answer one or two specific questions. There was a question about rejected papers. I mean, you showed some data. We actively do monitor papers that are rejected and where they go. Actually, Mark, who spoke earlier, he could probably give you a 5-hour seminar on all the great papers we've rejected over the last 2 to 3 years. So we do that. The data we've discussed, I mean, clearly, I mean, they're helpful, but it's no surprise to me that editors are hopeless at predicting which papers do well, because it's a very complex decision-making process. I mean, you made the point that editors are thinking about impact factor. Yes, that's something in the back of people's minds. I know your study was about, predicting, which ones would do well and how well they would do. But it's such a complex decision-making process that it's not a surprise, in fact, that they weren't very good. I think we know that we're not very good at predicting papers, so not that much of a surprise to me. And I think some of the suggestions that we've had, actually, I mean, John's suggestion about focusing on the really high, highly cited ones is probably a very good one. So thank you for that.
We're going to have to wrap
yeah,
it up.
the final thing is, though, could you tell me the names of the editors? Because I think we may need to have a purge at the BMJ. And nobody left was involved in that study. I noticed Joe Ross left a couple of hours ago. Okay, thank you.
Thanks for that insight. Thank you. Yeah.
We have one very, very fast.
So quick. This is all a fantastic conversation, a really fun paper and idea, but I'm so distracted by the 22 that were discussed and were selected for peer review at BMJ, and they weren't published within 3 years' time. Is that accurate?
Yeah, it's a good question.
Yeah.
I was thinking about this as I was going through the slides today. We should have had a look to see, what was predicted, what was their fate that was predicted.
And it's like
I
those
think we'll have to take this.
Okay.
Yeah.
offline.
Anyways,
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
That is not a quick question. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Thank you.